Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and the sport is hotting up. The final cricket teams are battling it out in the West Indies currently in the T20 World Cup. No team has yet been sent home from the European Football Championships, but that may change by the time I get to post this video. Sorry, Scotland. The final qualifiers are taking place all over the world for those final slots for the Olympic Games, and amidst this, no one is reading sports pulps any longer. Having now done a few of these deep dives, I can see the roots of where some of the storytelling we now still enjoy come from in popular fiction. Science fiction is still going strong. Horror is still going strong. Western has had its heyday, but still has its adherents and still has people writing Westerns. The same with adventure stories. Possibly the biggest success is romance stories, although people tend not to think of the romance pulps any longer. But for sports, I think probably alongside aviation are just two subjects which no longer grasp the imagination in the same way in thinking about stories. Planes and aviation have obviously lost their novelty factor that they had in the 30s and the 40s. We don't think of heroic pilots anymore in this sort of heads-up display, push-button, kill you from 1,000 miles away mode of fighting that we have. But for sports, I suppose in a world where you can watch any game at any time, live on television, on catch-up, from across the globe, what need would there be to go out and buy a book to read about fictional sports teams? You still have it in the films now and then, but I can't think of a famous fiction book about a sports team or a sports person probably since the advent of satellite television. This might be a shame, because I think we'll see when we're looking at sports stories, and if you look at sports in real life, there is great narrative there. You have underdog good stories. You have stories of overcoming the odds. You have teacher-pupil stories. You have rags to riches stories. There are a number of viewpoints you can take in a sports story. You're the participant, you're the opposition, you're the coach, you're the spectator. And it also allows writers to do what they love to do the most, and that is tell stories about writers, sports writers in this case, newspapermen. At the turn of the 20th century, there are no dedicated sports pulps. There are sports stories in the Argosy and Blue Book and some of the other slicks. You could make an argument for Tip Top Weekly with the Frank Merriwell adventures. But it's not really until Sports Story magazine where we have a dedicated magazine purely about sports. This is 1923 from Street and Smith. It's an immediate hit. It corners the market for a while. It has a circulation of 150,000, and where there is a hit, there will come the imitators, there will come the competition. And what you will also get is specialisation. In 1928, Fiction House release Fight Stories, which is purely concerned with boxing. Not every sport warrants its own titles, but the three big ones are boxing, football, American football, and baseball. But the generalist magazine is the most popular, and the market soon does become saturated. After the Great Depression, the resurgence of the pulps, we see from 1935 to 1940, 25 new titles. We see half a dozen titles alone from standard magazines, probably better known as like the Thrilling Group, and they have Thrilling Sports in 1936, Popular Sports Magazine in 1937, Exciting Sports in 1940, Thrilling Football in 1940, Popular Football in 1941, and Exciting Football in 1941. Outside of the Thrilling Group, there is Ace Sports, Sports Action, Sports Fiction, Dime Sports Magazine, 15 Sports Stories, Real Sports, which is odd because this was fiction, 12 Sports Aces, New Sports Magazine, Football Stories, Sports Novels Magazine. This proliferation gives pulp writers yet another outlet to get some more writing done. So we do see writers from the westerns turn their hand to sports. Tom Curry, Giles Lutz, Louis L'Amour. From detective pulps, William Campbell Galt, Robert Sale, Richard Leslie Bellham. From aviation, Joe Archibald, George Bruce. From science fiction, Nelson S. Bond, Oscar Friend and Ray Cummings. And of course, because this is a pulp overview, he's everywhere, you can't escape him, Robert E. Howard. But none of those writers appear in the issue of a sports magazine that I've selected. I did not know much about the provenance of these sports magazines, which are the great ones to look for. I did pretty much pick one at random, and the issue I've chosen is Super Sports, Volume 6, Issue 1. This is from February 1947. Because sports stories are set in the real world, there is no alternate dimension of sports, although some of the team names obviously are made up. It much more reflects the times, and 1947 is the immediate post-war period, and there is more than one example in the stories here of people coming back to sport from 3 years out fighting in the Pacific. You have other characters who have learned to play a particular sport whilst in the army or the navy. There's an example of a character who's returned with a disability. I mean, not one that affects his sport, otherwise that probably wouldn't make a great story. There are no Paralympics in 1947, but a boxer who has been kitted out with a device to help alleviate his hearing loss. And the shadow of the war in the magazine isn't limited to the stories either. There are still exhortations to buy victory bonds in advertisements. But let's go through the stories briefly. The cover story is The Killer Coach by T.W. Ford. As well as Super Sports, T.W. Ford also wrote for Sports Story. He also wrote westerns for Western Action and Real Western Pulp, and I believe he also wrote 2 issues of The Shadow. This story is about a mutiny that takes place within a college football team, where they are sick of their coach putting them in rough positions and making them take a lot of punishment, only in order for fresh legs to come on in the last quarter of the game, win the game and take the plaudits. These players believe that they can play this more expansive football as well. This is referred to as the hipper dipper stuff. Never heard the phrase before. But their taskmaster coach accedes to their demands at the last minute, lets them get on with it, essentially gives them enough rope to hang themselves, because the players have not seen the grand scheme of things. And it just occurs to me that there is an echo of this in the story, because there is, when they're playing their games, a radio link to someone who is right up at the back of the stadium with a pair of binoculars looking at the whole field of play and relaying information to the coach. When the players decide to do this themselves, it's the coach himself who goes up into the gods and has that overall view. But the story is a good example of the more moralistic tone that sports stories tend to have in the pulps. There is right and wrong in every kind of pulp. Westerns, very specifically dealing with stories about good people who turn bad, bad people who turn good, evil aliens and virtuous humans in science fiction, cops and robbers in the detective stories. But these are all known quantities. We know who the bad guys are, we know who the good guys are. With the sports stories, it's not, or often not, good versus evil, but it's youth and impetuousness versus age and experience. But when I say there are no bad guys in sports pulps, that's not strictly true. And the next story, A.R. Thurman's The Spoiler, is an example of this. War veteran Eddie Malloy returns to America and returns to the ring, wants to take a shot at the title. His contract is bought by a shady operator who has seen the potential in Eddie, but doesn't want that to spoil his chances of getting his chosen main fighter the shot at getting the title. So takes Eddie Malloy's contract with an idea of taking him out of the equation. I think from the few stories I've read, I get the idea that the chances of you being a boxing promoter and being as good as gold are virtually zero. Which is odd, because in the real world, boxing promoters are just paragons of virtue. The next story is Track Champ by Ted Stratton, who wrote detective stories and westerns as well, and also wrote under the name Terry Spain. This story deals with Tom Batson, who is a college student who enjoys some early great success in an event that he was not really supposed to be competing in. He wins a sprint race against the national champion, and it goes to his head, and he ignores his middle distance strengths in order to concentrate on chasing glory. And the story shows us that he's a young man with still some things to learn. The next story is, I think, the first time I've ever read a story about tennis. But there we are. Telltale Tennis by Richard Brister. Brister, again, also wrote detective stories, westerns, and this is the tale of a newspaper writer hooking up with a former tennis player who's only just become a former tennis player after a 20-odd year career. He's been advised by his doctors to stop playing, and this tennis player in France meets his former rival, someone who is always able to beat him and the only person who is always able to beat him. But this tennis player is down on his luck. Obviously France has just been through the war. No one is thinking about the pre-war sports stars. They all have their new heroes. And he asks Jim, who is this tennis player under doctor's orders, for one last exhibition match chance to show that he still has something, and with a view to getting a coaching job. So they both come out of retirement for one last hurrah, and I shan't spoil the end. The next story is The Scientific Age by Robert Densmore, and it's another boxing story and another nefarious boxing promoter. Again, this deals with a sportsman who has just gone into retirement after a long career, and through a series of events has to come out of retirement for one last fight against the champion. I think this might be my favourite story of the magazine. I really liked the main character, who is just, he's a pragmatic guy, but he's also been a virtuous guy all the way through his career. He's had such a long career because he's never taken the money to throw a fight. But despite all of this virtuous behaviour, he has to come out of retirement because of the bad behaviour of others. The next story, The Promoter by Cliff Campbell, is another story where one of the main characters is a writer. It's a short story. It's written by Cliff Campbell, who I think was a house name. The story is about a baseball player from the minor leagues who gets the attention of the regional press and gets himself signed to a large club. It's got a nice punchline to it. It's a very slight tale. Singing Birdies by Theodore J. Romer is a story about golf. So I'm not well disposed to it immediately, but I liked it well enough. It's really the story about two brothers, and they've fallen out over stuff that had happened during the war, but they are both professional golfers and find themselves pitted against each other in the final of a national tournament. And the final story is Arthur Mann, Roscoe and the Magic Bat, which was another baseball story. I'm not entirely sure this one works, and there is a lot about the construction and regulation of baseball bats, which I don't think I needed to know, but it did lead itself to some humorous points where a owner of a baseball club is desperate to get his own player disqualified from games. This baseball team owner, again, is a character who conducts some questionable underhand tactics in dealing with the baseball player's fiancée, but gets his comeuppance. There are a couple of bits of the magazine that I didn't read, and they were mostly dealing with real world sports, which I should imagine did intrude upon the sports fiction magazines, because people would have wanted to read about what's going on. So there was some rumour stuff there, not descriptions of games. I think they left that to the newspapers, but it dealt with real life sports situations and was more sort of a social diary column, shall we say, for sports, and I think supposed an awful lot of knowledge that I did not have about 1940s American sports. And that goes double for the quiz. I would never have got any of the questions right, ever. I think, in all candour, I enjoy other genres more, but I also think that I probably picked up more about the time in which these pulps were written by reading these stories. As they're all set in the contemporary world, as they are all, quite a few of them, New York based, but certainly all America based. Whether I believe the picture of America that they paint entirely, it's certainly teaching me what they thought about themselves or what they wanted to present about themselves. I think this particular time, 1947 as well, is where the sports pulp is trying and maybe failing to make itself relevant. I think some of the strength that it had enjoyed over the early 1940s is purely down to the disruption of the war to normal sports events. People wanted a little bit of sports action, they had to turn to the fiction. Now that the soldiers are home, these magazines are having to reflect and compete with real world sport gearing up again. I'm glad I read it. I'll read more pulp sports stories again, although I probably won't focus on the golf quite so much. But until next time, bye.